Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be my first video on the 24-25 FPL season. I will be looking at initially, of course, the price reveals that we've had so far. If you're a little bit more of a beginner player, if you're looking for how to play the game, don't worry about that. I will definitely be releasing some videos later down the line to illustrate my advice for the game, how the game works, what general strategies you should try to employ, how to be open-minded about how to play the game, and in general, of course, what to do to try and survive and have a great FPL season. Now, as far as obviously the initial prices, we haven't had all the prices revealed so far. We've had all the teams reveal around 5 to 6 players per team. And that's been helpful, right? Because I think for the most part, we know the most interesting assets of the game have already had their price revealed, barring, let's say, maybe Arsenal defense, maybe even Heung-min Son, for example. But for the most part, we've already had the prices that we want to see. And I think we can give a good guess to what the remaining prices will be. I think just to start off with, the most important thing I would say to sort of contextualize pricing is to, at least from a game week 1 perspective, look at fixture difficulty rating for the first few game weeks. At the same time, though, we also have to be objective with pricing, right? So I think the reality is, even if a team has, let's say, bad fixtures to start the season, if a player has been vastly underpriced, they might still be good to start the season with, or ultimately later down the line, they might end up becoming an extremely good pick when the fixtures get a little bit better for a certain team or a certain player. So that's something to point out. I think what I'll mention is I'll probably look at a fixture difficulty based lens, but I will talk objectively about a certain player and what I expect for them this season from the outset, just looking at pricing. Now, what I have is a fixture difficulty rating created by my friend 11fi. This has been taken from his website. You can find him on Twitter as at 11fi, or you can find his website on 11fi.substack.com. The most important thing is that he has a team strength model. So he kind of looks subjectively, of course, at the fixture difficulty rating. It's not just looking at, for example, the fact that, let's say, Ipswich is versus another relegation contender, therefore it's an easy game. It's more about what we expect from Ipswich in terms of their a model, for example, and then, of course, reconsidering whether they actually truly have a good fixture or not. Now, the reality, of course, is teams that were, close to relegation last season or teams that have promoted, our expectations for them are not so high. We've also seen them perform in the Premier League or in the Championship, and we have a baseline sort of expectation for these teams, and it's clearly going to be worse than, let's say, your Liverpools, your Arsenals, and your Man City. So, of course, as you can see with this fixture difficulty rating, it's not exactly a reflection of the league table last season. It clearly does take into account the quality of the fixtures for the first 6 game weeks, but of course, it's going to show you and reflect as well how strong certain teams already are within 11fi's team model, which I think actually has been very strong, very robust, a very good tool that I used last season myself. Now, starting from the top here, I think clearly you can see that Liverpool have sort of jumped quite a far bit ahead in terms of Arsenal and Man City, just due to the quality of fixtures, which already tells us, despite the change in manager, I think our expectations for Liverpool should still remain quite high, at least for the context of FPL in game week 1. So in general, if we can, for example, stretch towards 2 to 3 Liverpool players, I think that's a good starting point and position. And we'll talk about Liverpool pricing right now. So the most interesting thing that I find about Liverpool pricing, of course, is that Trent has had a pretty big downgrade in price. And a lot of people have mentioned, of course, that players like Guardiola are at 6 million. So, of course, the comparative is going to be naturally there, right? City have been a better defensive team. Arsenal have been the best defensive team that we've probably seen in the last 2-3 years. And they could obviously get even better, right? Maybe trying to bring in someone like Calafiori into the team. What I do like about Liverpool, though, is just quickly touching on Trent. We still know that he's an absolutely ludicrous attacker. He should still have a lot of set pieces on him. Not only just corners, but of course, the free kicks and the like. And I still think that he will be a very instrumental player. And given that the fixture difficulty run is so good, I have to say that Van Dijk at 6 million still is a decent price. I think you'd only really go for Virgil van Dijk maybe when double game weeks happen, maybe when fixtures are even better for Liverpool. I probably wouldn't double up now because, of course, the cost is quite high. But Trent, for me, does seem worth it, right? The drop of 1 million, I think, is quite significant in this. I think nothing has really substantially changed about Trent as a player. And for that reason, I think I do really like Trent. Particularly, of course, if you're going to consider a draft structure that doesn't include, for example, the combination of Haaland plus Salah. I'm sure you can still find a good draft that can actually fit Trent in and Haaland and Salah, but of course things do become difficult because of Haaland's increase in price. Although really it's the same as last season, right? Because Haaland has gone up by 1 million, Trent has gone down by 1 million as well, and Salah has practically remained the same in price. So that's what I like immediately about Liverpool. And then we can also see that Gakpo, Nunez, and even, for example, McAllister have some pretty decent prices. McAllister is only interesting to me if he takes penalties, but I don't think he will. The reality is I think Salah will continue to remain taking penalties. Maybe Arne Slot will actually change that, but until I actually do not see Salah taking a penalty, I will not believe that he will be off pens. Salah is at 12.5 million, and of course with Gakpo, Nunez 7.5, I have to imagine that someone like Diogo Jota, who would probably be a midfielder, I imagine, in terms of his classification within the game, would also be 7.5 million. So that's a bit of a guess for me now. Now, I think one of the concerns with Liverpool is that with what I saw from Feyenoord last season, a lot of their attackers actually did rotate quite a fair bit. So the minutes actually of the attackers within Feyenoord's team was not as consistent as, for example, the midfielders and the defenders. So one of my concerns is when you look at players like Nunez, Gakpo, even Jota, what are the minutes going to be like and how much rotation is there going to be? Is Salah also someone who could maybe disbenefit from that? From an initial starting position, I think that Salah is still a very good pick. Yes, of course, he does appear expensive because you can argue that last season probably was one of his worst. And of course, given his age, you might expect the trend to continue. But one thing I will say, of course, is that with such a great fixture difficulty run, it still begs the question of whether you want to consider starting the season anyways, captaining Salah and considering, Salah as almost close to being a perma captaincy option. So from that perspective, I do think that Salah is a very strong pick still, and he probably is going to land in my draft, right? Considering as well that Haaland as well has increased in price, and it's not like Man City's fixtures are better than Liverpool's. I think Liverpool's are just objectively better for the first 6 game weeks. So Salah for me makes a lot of sense. And at the same time, of course, as I said, Trent also makes sense if you can squeeze room to afford it, particularly, of course, if you're going to consider dropping Haaland. Now, the preseason might, of course, give us a little bit of a flavor as to understanding what is going to happen with Gakpo's positioning. Probably going to play left wing, to be honest, which is why I don't really like the fact that he's moved to a forward position in FPL. Nunez and Jota, of course, will also continue to fight out for minutes. So that is going to be interesting, but I still probably wouldn't start with any of these players right now. Maybe Jota could be the interesting one, particularly if he's classified as a midfielder. But until that happens, I think that's pretty much my thoughts on Liverpool. Very, very strong starting fixtures and decent prices, to be honest, considering what the prices were last season. And even though, as I said, a lot of the defender prices are very, very high still, right? Like Trent still feels high compared to some of the other defenders of the game. The fixtures, I think, do really matter here, and that's what makes him a good pick. Not necessarily objectively, but definitely for the start of the FPL season, I think he's a great pick. Now, moving on to the second team, of course, we have Man City. Man City's prices, of course, reflected a little bit of inflation towards Foden being the player of the season, and of course, Guardiola going on a very good run at the end. But I still think Guardiola actually ended up being pretty underpriced, and to be honest, I think Guardiola is very similar to Trent in that he should be a lock for the start of the season. So for me, with Guardiola sort of change in positioning from the last season, I can't imagine that City would radically change to the way that they play, and I'm not expecting for Guardiola to suddenly have left wing's level of returns like he did near the end. But I think just the opportunity to have someone who could be quite nailed within this Man City team, who is also extremely attacking compared to any of the other defenders within the team, makes Guardiola definitely worth 6 million. And at the end of the day, City were still the second best defense by quite a far mile in the previous season. So for that context, I think Guardiola is just an absolute steal at that price, and I think he's actually already become a template pick for game week 1. Now, as far as Foden and De Bruyne, I think it's nice that they finally dropped De Bruyne after maybe 2 seasons of, unfortunately, injury sort of ridden impacts, right? And I think it's nice that Foden, of course, has gotten a nice buff given the fact that he had such a great season. He still is actually cheaper than the likes of Saka and Palmer. Now, of course, he doesn't have penalties, but what we did see close to the end of the last season is that he did seemingly take a lot of free kicks as well. And of course, he's become a lot more instrumental into the team in terms of his minutes. And so I think from that context, Foden is just an incredible pick. The question, of course, is going to be at the start of the season, will you go for Foden? I do think that a lot of people will think about the idea of Foden covering Haaland, but the reality, I think, is no one really covers anyone unless you're looking at defenses, right? If you're looking at, let's say, Arsenal, if you're going for clean sheets, there is definitely coverage there. But when it comes to sort of singular attacking returns. We've seen games where Foden has had crazy hauls and Haaland hasn't, and vice versa as well, right? So I think the reality is that you don't necessarily need to think about it as coverage. If you can find an equivalent pick at around Foden's pricing, maybe even a little bit below or a little bit higher, that's totally fine. But I don't think we should think about Foden as some sort of Haaland coverage. If you want to go for Foden, that's totally fine. An incredible player. But I do think that maybe at the start of the season, given that Man City's fixtures are not that exquisite, that maybe we can pass on Foden for a bit. And of course, if there's a sweeter Man City run later down the line, you can definitely sort of include him into your team. But nothing really altogether wrong with starting the season with Foden, particularly if you're also going to plan, let's say, an early wild card, right? If you want an early wild card after Man City's really good fixtures between game weeks 2 and 4, there's nothing really stopping you from doing that. So I think that makes a lot of sense too. Foden feels nicely priced to me. The other prices I'm not too I don't really care about it right now, other than Alvarez. I'll say I don't like the fact that obviously Alvarez might be subject to a move away from Man City, but the reality, of course, is if Haaland gets injured again, Alvarez at this price point at 7 million does feel a little bit too low. It will make the game a little bit easy in that sense, where a lot of people will just move towards Alvarez because he'll be on penalties, because he'll just be much more interesting as a pick, right, when he becomes the center forward for the team. So moving on, of course, we have Arsenal. Now, Arsenal's an interesting team because I think what's concerning to me about Arsenal is that ultimately we probably still want to go deeply into Arsenal. A lot of people did go triple Arsenal for most of last season because they were absurdly well priced. Now, of course, you can see the sort of inflation has taken hit. And Raya, for example, is a 5.5 million goalkeeper. Timber's class is 5.5. I imagine Ben White, Saliba, and Gabriel will all be above 6 million or at 6 million. I think more so Saliba and Gabriel probably 6 million. Ben White probably 6.5. That's my guess. And Saka 10 million is interesting, right? Because, of course, penalty taker, and at the start of the season, we had some uncertainty between Odegaard and Saka, but that's obviously cleared up. I think Saka now is just the outright penalty taker. And then, of course, Odegaard has actually, come out at a really good price. I think being 1.5 million below Saka actually means that Odegaard is a very relevant pick. And at the same price point as well as Bruno Fernandes, there's definitely something to be considered with Odegaard as opposed to Saka, particularly, of course, if you think that, let's say, when you look at the fixtures for Arsenal right now, arguably, the value to going for Saka might just be to captain on game weeks 1 and 3. But the thing is, if you, let's say, have Salah plus Haaland, it almost covers off the need, I suppose, to have such a strong captaincy option. And therefore, of course, if you're just looking for a pick who's just going to be strong and someone who you're not going to captain, Odegaard does present himself as a very good option. You don't necessarily need to have Salah plus Saka plus Haaland. So I don't think it's even really that plausible to actually create drafts that include 3 premiums per se. And I really think that it's time now to call Saka and Palmer premiums, because I think if you're priced more than 10 million, and that applies to probably Heung-min Son, who will be priced there as well, you're going to be a premium. And I think it's very hard to create a well-rounded team like that. And also, you don't necessarily need to do that because it's not like there are that many great captaincies at play here. So I think at the start of the season, definitely Arsenal defense is going to be interesting regardless because they're such a strong defense. Raya, I still think, feels a little bit cheap, particularly since they actually look like an even better defense than, let's say, City, for example, in the previous season coming into the last. And that's sort of my initial thoughts on Arsenal. I think they were well priced and they definitely deserve some good price increases. The next team is going to be Aston Villa. And I think Aston Villa is the most interesting one because I think Watkins still feels very lowly priced, right? 9 million, of course, in context feels quite high for a player, but when you actually put into context that Aston Villa just have amazing games to start the season, that Watkins could very well be on penalties. Now, of course, there's Tielemans in the team. There's even McGinn, who's taken 1 career penalty. And of course, Watkins not taking penalties in the past is going to be something that a lot of people question. But with Douglas Luiz leaving the club, him going to Juventus, I do think that there's an opportunity for Watkins to maybe reassert himself in the penalty-taking picture. And I think also Tielemans, you can argue, is not someone who's nailed within this Aston Villa team as it stands, right? He is more of a substitute. Sometimes he can play a starting role within the team, but he's not someone who's going to start permanently. And as I said, even though Watkins has a very, very poor career historical penalty-taking record, he still might try to reassert himself on penalties, and I think that's still plausible to me, which makes him obviously even better as a pick. And the underlying data for Watkins was honestly excellent last season, and Aston Villa played like a very top team. With the fixture difficulty as it stands, I think he is a very logical pick. The issue, I suppose, is going to be compared to, let's say, Havertz at 8 million from Arsenal. The question is whether you actually even need to really stretch towards going for Watkins at the start of the season, particularly if Arsenal do not get another forward, let's say in place of Havertz. So I do kind of think that price wise, maybe Watkins is still worth it, just simply because he's that good of a pick. And I still think, you know, if you were to compare him to Havertz, I'd still definitely take Watkins. But there's a 1 million difference there. And the question, of course, is whether you even need to spend that 1 million. So something to think about for sure. As far as Chelsea, this is an interesting one because, of course, Palmer got a huge price increase. And at 10.5 million with Nkunku being 6.5, which I think was the biggest sort of crazy price action that we've seen, right? Nkunku, a player who was very prolific in the Bundesliga. Yes, of course, he was injured last season, but I think one point to be made is that he's not someone who has reached the Reece James level of sort of injury proneness yet. I don't think I think the jury is still out on Nkunku. And it's not like, for example, he's suffering like Reece James, where Reece James hasn't even played, I think, 3 straight games of active football since 2 or 3 seasons ago. Whereas Nkunku obviously has had one really, really bad injury season and then some small niggling injuries when it comes back to his career in Red Bull Leipzig. So I think Nkunku definitely can reassert himself into this Chelsea team and definitely become a starter. And at 6.5, considering the underlying data he had in the Bundesliga and the extremely small sample size last season in the Premier League, I just think he's an absolute steal, particularly since he also was moved from a forward to a midfielder. So access to clean sheet points, access to the additional goal point makes Nkunku a little bit ridiculous. And with Palmer, I think all it means is that he is no longer a set and forget player within the game. It doesn't mean that he's ridiculously overpriced. It just means that you need to find a perfect, basically, Chelsea fixture run to really, I think, justify going for Palmer. Because whenever you have these situations, I think you're probably not going to have 2 to 3 premiums at any one time, unless you can obviously afford a lot more budget picks within the game. And that's, I suppose, the issue that you'll have to deal with, right? Either you drop Haaland and maybe you can actually have, let's say, a Salah plus then Saka and Palmer, or of course you go for Salah plus Haaland, and that also means that you've sort of closed yourself off from the option of going for players like Saka and Palmer, which is honestly probable, right? Both options are probable. Even just going Salah only is probable if you just consider the idea that you can go for players like Nkunku and he is very, very cheaply priced. I think the defense for Chelsea also feels a little bit low. Going back to, let's say, Chelsea and Aston Villa, given that they're the teams that are outside of the top 3 in terms of sort of like echelons of defense within the Premier League, I have to say Aston Villa and Chelsea defense are not too bad to start the season with. Aston Villa defense specifically, players like Konsa, for example, at 4.5 million, just a great price point. Even Maatsen, if we actually think he'll be nailed, which I think is unlikely, given that they actually still have 3 left backs at the club, and I can't see too much sort of transfer activity around Alex Moreno and Luka Dean, I would have to say, yeah, the most interesting thing about Aston Villa is probably the price of Konsa at 4.5 just to start the season as a very stable 4.5 defender. And then with Chelsea, of course, you know, you still have decent defenders at decent price points. So I think Chelsea is an interesting club, but we also have to contextualize that they do have a change in manager, and that always is going to have a small impact in terms of how well teams perform to start off with. But the reality, of course, with Chelsea too is that ultimately they did actually play very well to close out the season, and it seems like, of course, players like Cucurella, even players like Malo Gusto, of course, have sort of improved their, I suppose, importance into the team. But, you know, with a change in manager, with them more likely to sort of prefer these sort of inverting, I suppose, the fullbacks, that could suit Cucurella more, for example, than someone like maybe Malo Gusto. And that's just a little bit of a guess for me at this moment in time. As far as obviously some of the other Chelsea players that we can talk about, I think Jackson is at a decent price, but once again, I think more fixture run dependent. He has great underlying data, and obviously we really did enjoy Jackson close to the end of the season, but that was obviously with the sort of added proviso of us having much better fixtures. James being 5.0 million probably just suggests that we can maybe get access to some starting Chelsea center backs at 4.5, but also they actually do always have a lot of center backs, so we kind of need to see what the sort of standout pairing might be coming out of the preseason, which is the only thing I'll say about Chelsea for now. Now, the next team is going to be Newcastle United. I think Newcastle United is interesting because if you sort of just think about the first 5 fixtures, right? If you shorten the fixture difficulty to just the first 5, they would probably be even higher up in this list, which also calls into question, of course, maybe just starting with at least double Newcastle, right? It's definitely plausible. What I like about Newcastle, of course, is Isak's price just seems ridiculous. Now, he actually seemingly lost or maybe had penalties when he was chasing for the golden boot at one point before Haaland sort of blew the race out of the water with the poker that he scored versus Wolves. But Isak did take penalties until he missed. And since that point, I don't think we've seen a penalty taken between him and Wilson. Now, Wilson, of course, is sort of approaching the tail end of his career, but he's still someone that I think is important to the squad, as Eddie Howe would mention, and Isak, of course, would be an even better pick if he's on penalties all the time. Now, I'm not necessarily sure whether that's the case, but I think that given the opening run being so good and Isak's minutes actually becoming amazing close to the end of last season, particularly since he was injury-free, that just makes Isak an amazing pick for me for now. And I think I definitely would consider starting the season with Isak just because the fixture run is that sweet for Newcastle. And I think the same logic does apply to Anthony Gordon, even though he's a little bit more dull as a pick, right? If you can consider the context of Anthony Gordon being a much better player when he's on set pieces, like for example, when Trippier's out injured, when, let's say, Trippier's back into the team, you're taking away a lot of avenues for Anthony Gordon to get additional points and even bonus points. And so I do think that even though he's got a great fixture run to start with, he's not necessarily a 100% nailed option, but he's definitely someone that is interesting to me for this moment in time. And the defense is actually well priced in the sense that someone like Dan Burn is 4.5 million. Whereas obviously Fabian Schär is very, very expensive. I think Fabian Schär arguably is even overpriced, if I can say so, just because he is a center back at the end of the day. Yes, of course, he's someone who likes to take shots, but I think him being much more expensive just means that he's out of the question, particularly when Trippier is so close and so much within reach as a 6 million option. So we might even consider starting the season with Trippier just because that opening run is that good. But of course, there was a bit of a drop off for Newcastle defense last season, and I think we're all aware of that. But as I said, given that the fixtures are so good to start the season with, there's nothing to say that you can't start something like triple Newcastle to start the season and you can benefit from that. And apologies, sorry, of course, Fabian Schär was 5.5 million, which I think is just a little bit ludicrous as it stands anyways. So just to correct myself. But Barnes is also, I think, a great pick, given that Gordon's 7.5 million. And also it seems like, of course, you still have players like Almiron at the club for Newcastle. But there's absolutely nothing that's going to really stop, let's say, Barnes from actually becoming a out and out starter for this team, because of course close to the end of the season we did actually tend to see that Barnes was favored and Almiron of course was injured. If we get to see the preseason for Newcastle a little bit more, if we get a feeling that Barnes is going to be nailed, of course at 6.5 million, that's a ridiculous price point. But I think Gordon is the safest in terms of minutes, and that's why you're sort of paying for that premium. But at one point in the season, Barnes of course is going to be a very interesting pick for Newcastle no matter what. And then going after that, I think United, Crystal Palace, Tottenham. Amongst these teams, I think the only interesting prices, of course, is that United players have been significantly dropped in price. Bruno Fernandes has remained in price. Garnacho got a price increase, but Rashford had a huge drop to 7 million. And Lisandro Martinez is at 4.5. That probably indicates that Shaw's at 5 million. Looking at Crystal Palace, of course, I think Eze is at a ridiculous price point. I like him a lot. I think Bruno and Eze, I think, are the most interesting picks, obviously, between the two teams. Given that the sort of fixture difficulty, I think, is quite similar between both teams, if we're being honest. Even when you look at, for example, the way that United and Crystal Palace's fixtures fall down, Game Week 3 and Game Week 5 seem equally difficult for both teams. And obviously, considering the price point of Eze, there's absolutely no reason to sort of ignore the idea of starting the season with Eze as opposed to someone like Bruno, who's a little bit more expensive. You can definitely consider, of course, going for either defender. I think Crystal Palace were so much more of a better defense last season and have been really for the last 3-4 years very consistently a sort of top 4, top 5 defense, but clearly, a complete echelon below the Cities, the Arsenals, and the Liverpools of the world, that there's nothing really wrong with starting the season with just simply Crystal Palace defenders, and just making sure that if you, let's say, go for 4.5 Crystal Palace defenders, that you rotate around maybe or you have at least a replacement option for game weeks 3 and 5 if you'd like to do so. There is obviously the alternative approach where you just simply go for premium defenders, right? If you go for, let's say, a no Haaland approach, we've already discussed Liverpool, Man City, and Arsenal. There's nothing stopping you from really just going for one player from each of those teams and basically having a foolproof defense from that context. But of course, the budget defense right now appears to be coming from, at least at the start of the season, teams like Aston Villa, maybe Chelsea, but definitely Crystal Palace and probably United if you have the confidence that they can make a big step up and you can simply go for someone like Lisandro Martinez to start the season with. Tottenham, I think, is an interesting one because we had Maddison's price. It does seem good, but I don't think the fixtures are necessarily good enough to scream that we have to start the season with Maddison. Using Newcastle and Gordon as an example, I think I'd much rather go there, for example, at a 7.5 million price point. Son is probably going to be, priced at that sort of 10 million bracket, and I still think Chelsea and Arsenal have better games. So, of course, there's no necessary reason to absolutely go for a Tottenham player at the start, and I think that the same applies to Porro and Udogie. But whenever Tottenham have a much sweeter run within the game, there's always going to be an opportunity to go to those sorts of players. With Brighton, I think I have to say that João Pedro is just at a ridiculous price point. I think at 5.5 million, he might be the absolute steal in FPL. Now, of course, there is a new manager, and we have to see what happens with the preseason in terms of where João Pedro is going to be situated, right? Of course, we know Evan Ferguson is coming back. Mitoma, of course, is also back in the game as well. And of course, that's going to have an impact on where João Pedro can reasonably play. I do think that obviously he can play just as a second striker, or obviously as someone just playing just behind effectively Evan Ferguson. And I don't really see him losing penalties as well. So at 5.5 million, if you can get access to hopefully a rejuvenated Brighton team, which already is a huge improvement, right? If you want to sort of compare price points, Southampton's forward is 5.5 million as well. And so if João Pedro's 5.5 million is a penalty taker, playing for a much stronger team in Brighton with a new sort of what seemingly is going to be an attacking manager, I just can't see how he would be a bad option, unless, of course, we do think that he's not going to fit within the starting 11. But I might even remind a lot of people, at the start of last season, Roberto De Zerbi, effectively within game weeks 2 and 3, already sort of determined that João Pedro was not someone who really understood his press. By the mid-season, he already sort of, I think, loved João Pedro and was absolutely gassing him up as effectively sort of the most important player of the team. And this was obviously with Mitoma injured as well. So I do think João Pedro has really moved on a lot in terms of sort of his development as a player. But of course, with a new manager, things have to change. And we just need to assess that in the preseason. But I think he is just at a ridiculous price point. And if you're going for something like a 3-4-3 structure, or you want to look for a rotating option, I mean, João Pedro is there for you with great fixtures as well in game weeks 1, 4, and 5 as well. So that is interesting context. With the other teams, I don't think there are any sort of price points that I think were absolutely ridiculous. I think the only player that I might mention between, let's say, Ipswich and Wolves are, players like Leif Davis or Ait Nouri, interesting 4.5 defenders that obviously when they have a good fixture run, we might consider them. But for the most part, they do right now strike out as very weak defenses. And one of the issues that classically is the case with FPL is that whilst you can have attacking fullbacks from much weaker teams that look excellent and are very good attackers, the issue, of course, is going to be they do play within a very weak team and they are very prone to conceding a lot of goals. And Luton Town, I think, and Alfie Doughty is a great example of that last season. Someone who was on a lot of set pieces, was actually a very good set piece taker, averaged a lot of XA per 90, and ultimately just didn't get too many points in FPL outside of double game weeks, because the reality is Luton were unfortunately conceding probably more than 2 goals a week, and that obviously has a huge impact on defenders and their ability to get holes. Now, Leif Davis has extraordinary numbers coming from the Championship. Ait Nouri, we saw sort of play multiple roles within the team, even, for example, playing as a forward for Wolves. So these are interesting players, but given their price points, I think I'd still probably pass up on them. I think with West Ham, the only player I'll mention is Kudus. I think is at a really good price point. So is Areola at 4.5 million, once again, as a goalkeeper. I think Brentford too, just to sort of iterate, they have really tough fixtures to start the season, but I imagine that Flecken will be one of the best 4.5 goalkeepers by the end of the season. That's just my guess. I can't really see Brentford and Flecken, for example, underperforming at the end of the season. But of course, to start the season with that bad of a fixture run, considering that a lot of us might be going for an early wild card, there's no interest there for me to really go for a keeper like that. So we might be looking at, for example, whether the new manager will stop rotating, for example, in Brighton, and maybe we can get access to, let's say, a Verbruggen at 4.5. I think that would be very interesting to start the season with. And hopefully that does happen, because of course the Jason Steele rotation was not great last season. But if Verbruggen gets to start this season, and you consider that Brighton's fixture difficulty is really good, then he's an option as well. Crystal Palace goalkeeper as well, that's going to be a good steal. Unfortunately, players like Onana, Vicario are a little bit overpriced at 5 for now, and you just have access to their defense at 4.5 within the defenders. So that's something to mention. Those are my early pricing thoughts. I think the major things, I think the most sort of underpriced players right now do seem to be rather, Nkunku and João Pedro to me. At the same time, I think that all structures do still seem viable, which I think is the beauty of this year's pricing, right? With the good pricing over Saka, Palmer, Foden, players like Salah and Haaland as well, and Haaland generally sort of begging the question with that sort of additional price increase, whether you go for, let's say, you know, a no premium structure, a Haaland structure, a Salah only structure, a Salah plus Haaland structure. These are the questions that we're asking right now. And I think the fact that I haven't really found something that I think is definitely going to be the template within the sort of initial price reveals and that sort of batch of price reveals is nice. But those are sort of my initial thoughts. I think, once again, going back to the forwards, it feels like the forwards were very cheap this season compared to the midfielders. Whereas, for example, players like Isak, Havertz, Watkins immediately strike out to me as being really good, but then João Pedro's obviously there. So the question, of course, is going to be whether you go for someone like João Pedro and who you drop out in the forward position and whether that's going to lose you a lot of points. But those are my initial thoughts once again, and thank you guys so much for watching. A little bit of a longer video, but I hope these kind of present my initial thoughts early, and then we can jump into drafts later next week, as well as sort of videos on how to play and sort of advice that I have, generally speaking, on FPL. So thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys soon.